On a July evening in 1999, 90,185 people at the Rose Bowl held their breath as Brandi Chastain walked to the penalty spot. Her foot met the ball, the net rippled. She fell to her knees, then ripped off her jersey, arms raised like a release. That photograph became shorthand for triumph and for a stubborn question that still haunts sport. Who gets to be seen and who gets to be paid? Women slipped into the modern Olympic record books for the first time in Paris, 1900, a handful of tennis rackets and parasols on the grass. By Amsterdam in 1928, the conversation had already shifted to limits, with some arguing that long-distance events were improper for female bodies. For decades, the story of women in sport looked like a series of small rebellions inside a larger exclusion. Governance, money, and locker rooms were organized around men, and the default assumption was that women were incidental. That began to change not only on fields, but in law. In the United States, Title IX arrived as a short sentence in the Education Amendments of 1972, introduced by Senator Birch Bayh, carried by Representative Patsy Mink, and signed by President Richard Nixon on June 23, 1972. Its promise was simple and seismic. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program receiving federal financial assistance. Before Title IX, only a few 100,000 girls played high school sports. Opportunities were sporadic and often underfunded. The law did not suddenly turn stadium lights on, but it provided a legal lever and a cultural frame. On the ground, the moments were vivid and immediate. In 1967, Catherine Switzer registered for the Boston Marathon as KV Switzer and felt an official try to tear a bib off her chest. On tennis courts, Billie Jean King was arguing that the sport deserved dignity and pay. The smell of chalk in a gym, the hot breath of an official, a ripped bib, the sting of a referee whistle, these small sensory moments became the hinge of a much larger shift. Title IX set out the map, but the terrain to be crossed was raw and uneven. The first real crack in the old order arrived. Not in a courtroom, but under stadium lights and in the back rooms of colleges balancing budgets. It came in 1973 when Billie Jean King walked into the Houston Astrodome to face Bobby Riggs in what would be called the Battle of the Sexes. The noise felt physical, pressure on the skin. Television cameras spit heat. When King nailed the final volley and slammed her fist, it was a punctuation mark that echoed around the world. King had been more than a player for years. She helped start the Virginia Slim circuit, and in June 1973 helped create the Women's Tennis Association to wrest control of the sport from a male-dominated hierarchy. That same decade, Title IX began its slow, bureaucratic work. With a few legal words, schools could no longer ignore obvious inequality. Programs started, schedules were reworked, and athletic directors had to answer questions about who received funding. Participation numbers were blunt. High school girls' participation rose from under 300,000 in 1971 to millions in the decades that followed. Progress remained jagged. Some administrators complied on paper while cutting budgets or limiting scholarships. Women's teams practiced on leftover floors or late at night while men's teams took prime hours. Coaches told stories about renting equipment with their own money and buses that smelled of old sweat. The U.S. Open became the first Grand Slam to offer equal prize money in 1973, but that victory was the exception rather than the rule. On television, networks that carried men's basketball in prime time gave women's games slivers of airtime. Grassroots energy had met institutional inertia, and the result was a tug of war. Public triumphs like King's and Switzer's exposed how much still needed building and set the scene for a new phase where commerce and fame would test whether progress could survive the marketplace. In the decades after Title IX, the story bifurcated. Talent and fans multiplied while the business model lagged. The WNBA was founded in 1996 and played its first season in 1997, a visible American attempt to build a sustainable professional home for women basketball players. Soccer followed a boom and bust pattern. The 1999 FIFA Women's World Cup in the United States exploded when tens of thousands filled the Rose Bowl to see Brandi Chastain and her teammates turn a victory into an image burned into national memory. That crowd was not an isolated mood. An entire generation of girls started dreaming of cleats instead of dolls. Yet the business side was brittle. Early professional ventures folded under financial strain before the National Women's Soccer League launched in 2013 and slowly stabilized. Stars amplified the pressure. Mia Hamm and Julie Foudy in the 1990s and later Megan Rapinoe and Alex Morgan won trophies and then asked pointed questions about pay and promotion. In tennis, Billie Jean King's early organizing evolved into a professional circuit where Serena Williams could become a global brand, but even she has had to fight for fair treatment in moments on court and in media portrayals. Then a revelation reframed the economics. When women's events were packaged and promoted, they could draw large crowds and sustain TV and streaming audiences. Social media let athletes speak directly to fans, build brands, and sell products without waiting for network permission. That opened hope, but created new barriers. Sponsors and networks took notice, but turning spikes of attention around World Cups or Olympics into year-round revenue required better agreements, smarter marketing, and institutional courage to repackage women's sport for a modern audience. The last decade pushed that contradiction to a breaking point. Public moments and private litigation made it impossible for leagues, federations, and networks to pretend the system was fine. Athletes set records and broke viewership ceilings while many still grappled with low contracts, second jobs, and bus rides instead of charter flights. After World Cup victories in 2015 and 2019, the U.S. women's national team lodged complaints and in 2019 filed a federal lawsuit using trophies and ratings as evidence they had been undervalued. WNBA players continued to fly overseas in winter for pay that matched their level. In 2020, the WNBA and its players' union ratified a new collective bargaining agreement that raised pay, expanded revenue sharing, and built in stronger maternity protections, proof that organized pressure could produce structural change. The pandemic accelerated both danger and opportunity. Leagues faced revenue collapses that threatened fragile budgets, but streaming boomed and social platforms meant games could find passionate global audiences without traditional gatekeepers. At the same time, athletes like Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles publicly prioritized mental health, withdrawing from marquee events and forcing institutions to account for well-being, not just medals. Sponsors slowly shifted their calculus, favoring athletes who combined excellence with an authentic voice. The pressure cooker of financial fragility, cultural demand, and athlete activism was hot and loud. The central question moved from whether women could win to whether federations, leagues, and broadcasters would rewrite the economic equations that had kept women's sport marginal. Then came a pivot, not a single ruling or solitary contract, but a dense moment when pressure, publicity, and market logic collided and institutions had to choose. The U.S. women's national team's legal fight, the WNBA's bargaining leverage, public fury at unequal NCAA treatment in 2021, and the cultural weight of athletes prioritizing mental health converged into sustained demand for change. Networks began to bid for women's finals and sponsors reallocated dollars, not out of charity but because campaigns featuring female athletes drove engagement. The consequences were tangible. Players negotiated better pay and protections in new contracts. Leagues locked in longer-term broadcast relationships. Universities faced more intense Title IX scrutiny. Advertisers put women's tournaments at the center of brand stories, and top athletes landed multi-year sponsorships that pumped fresh money into training, facilities, and youth development. The cultural shift was visceral. A girl who once had only that single photograph of Brandi Chastain now sees Rapinoe and Serena on billboards, hears women's finals on major networks, and can imagine a professional life in sport that her mother was denied. The pivot did not close every gap overnight, but it changed the default from invisibility to potential visibility, and from inevitable underpayment to real negotiation. The ripple effects are visible across law, industry, and culture. Title IX remains the legal backbone for school-based opportunity, while new collective bargaining agreements and litigation have forced leagues to rewrite compensation models and include maternity and mental health protections. Media companies are experimenting with dedicated coverage, streaming packages, and long-form storytelling that treat women's sport as inventory to grow rather than filler. Investors are beginning to build franchises with longer horizons, recognizing that ticket sales, merchandise, and subscriptions increase when leagues commit to quality production and athlete promotion. The change is generational. Girls who once hid cleats now have camps, scholarships, and professional pathways, and they are less likely to drop out because the pipeline offers tangible returns. Yet the work is unfinished. Coverage remains uneven, pay gaps persist, and leadership tables still underrepresent women. The road to equity will require stricter policy enforcement, smarter commercialization, and continued athlete leadership. If a photograph at the Rose Bowl could ignite a conversation decades ago, the next decade may be defined by an industry that finally treats women's sport as a mainstream economic and cultural good. The stakes are not only fairness and respect, they are a multi-billion-dollar opportunity and a promise to the next generation that the fields they run across will belong to them too.